Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at some research on how different brain diseases can affect the shape of those deeper brain structures.
Yeah.
We're talking 842 brains studied.
Uh-huh.
Researchers combined MRI scans and actual tissue analysis.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, the level of detail in this study is incredible.
It's really impressive work. Think of it like this. They were able to pinpoint exactly where shrinkage was happening in these tiny structures deep inside the brain. It's not something you could easily see with a typical brain scan.
Okay, so before we get into the details, I need a quick refresher. We're talking about conditions like Alzheimer's, right? What are some other examples of these neuropathologies they study?
So Alzheimer's is one, and its hallmark is something called tangles, which are basically twisted protein fibers inside brain cells.
Okay.
They also looked at late NC, which is another type of dementia,
Okay.
atherosclerosis, which is hardening of the arteries
Right.
and even the effects of small strokes.
Got it. So these are all conditions that can affect the brain as we get older. But this research wasn't done on living patients, right? Where did they get all these brains?
That's right.
Hmm.
This was what's called an ex vivo study, meaning they examined the brains after death.
Right.
But these brains were donated by people who participated in long-term studies on aging. So the researchers actually had a ton of information about each person,
Okay.
their health history, even cognitive test results from when they were alive.
Wow. So they were able to connect all those dots between someone's health throughout life and what they were seeing in their brain after death. That's powerful stuff. But I'm curious, how do you even study the shape of these tiny brain structures in such detail?
Well, they used a very precise 3D mapping technique to measure those subtle differences in shape.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it like having a microscopic ruler for the brain.
Okay.
This allowed them to see if different diseases were causing shrinkage in specific areas.
That's some seriously high-tech brain mapping. What stands out to you about their findings? Did they see those unique shrinkage patterns?
Absolutely. That was one of the big takeaways. Different diseases really did seem to target distinct areas of these deeper brain structures. For example, those tangles we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
They were associated with shrinkage across all 6 of the structures they examined.
So tangles have a very widespread impact, which makes sense, given what we know about Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
What about those other conditions? Were the effects as widespread?
Not necessarily.
Oh.
For example, they found that late NC and atherosclerosis both caused shrinkage in the hippocampus and the amygdala. Now, these are 2 areas of the brain that are really important for memory and emotional processing.
Okay. That makes sense, given that those are both conditions that can affect thinking and memory.
Right.
But you said they both cause shrinkage in those areas, so what's so unique about that?
The key here is that even though they were affecting the same general areas,
Yeah.
they were shrinking different parts within those areas. It's like each disease has its own fingerprint, causing damage in a very specific way.
Ah, so it's not just about where the brain is shrinking, but the pattern of shrinkage that helps distinguish one disease from another.
Exactly. And that's what makes this research so exciting. It suggests that we might be able to use these unique patterns to diagnose brain diseases in living patients using advanced brain scans.
Wait, so even though this research was done on brains that were no longer in living patients,
Yeah.
they think these findings could be used to diagnose people while they're still alive.
That's the hope.
Yep.
Now, it's still early days, but the idea is that if we can refine brain scanning technology to pick up on these subtle shape differences,
Right.
we could potentially diagnose these conditions much earlier, even before symptoms become really noticeable.
That would be huge. Imagine being able to catch these diseases in the early stages when treatments might be more effective, but I'm guessing that's still a long way off.
It is. There's a lot more research needed to translate these findings into actual diagnostic tools, but it's definitely a promising avenue to explore. And this study is a big step in the right direction. It gives us a much clearer roadmap of which brain areas are most vulnerable to different diseases.
It's like they've given us a treasure map to the brain. So even though they didn't see outward changes in the brain, just the shrinkage, the fact that it's so specific to each disease is what makes this research so groundbreaking.
Exactly. It really highlights the potential for using these patterns as a diagnostic tool. But this is just the beginning. There are still so many questions to explore, like how do these structural changes actually relate to the cognitive decline we see in these conditions?
So this research has opened up a whole new set of questions, and I bet it has implications for how we think about treating these conditions too. Let's take a deeper look at some of those aspects after a quick break.
That's good.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about those distinct shrinkage patterns and how they could be used to diagnose brain diseases. It's fascinating how specific those patterns are.
It is remarkable, isn't it? This study wasn't just about identifying those shrinking areas. They were actually able to measure how much shrinkage was happening in each spot, which gives us even more information. Okay, so not just where, but also how much shrinkage. I'm guessing that's important for understanding how severe the disease is.
Precisely. By measuring the extent of this shrinkage, we could potentially track how the disease is progressing over time. It's like having a speedometer for brain degeneration.
Oh, a speedometer for the brain. That's a powerful image. So we could see if a disease is progressing quickly or slowly.
Exactly. And that kind of information would be incredibly valuable for both diagnosis and treatment. If we can identify those fast-progressing cases early on, we might be able to intervene more aggressively and potentially slow down the disease's course.
So this isn't just about understanding these diseases better in a theoretical sense. It has real-world implications for how we approach patient care.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes this research so compelling. It's not just an academic exercise. It has the potential to truly transform how we diagnose and treat brain diseases.
You mentioned earlier that we might be able to use these findings to diagnose people while they're still alive, but I'm curious, how realistic is that? This research was done on brains that were no longer functioning. Can we really translate those findings to living, breathing people?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But I think it's important to remember that brain imaging technology is constantly evolving. We already have techniques like high-resolution structural MRI that can create incredibly detailed 3D images of the brain.
So we're talking about technology that can essentially zoom in on these tiny structures deep inside the brain and see those subtle shape changes.
That's the idea. And with the power of artificial intelligence, we can even train algorithms to analyze these images and automatically detect those unique shrinkage patterns we've been discussing.
AI and brain scans, that's some serious future tech. But if that's the future, what makes this particular research so special?
What sets this study apart is the sheer scale and depth of the data. Remember, they studied 842 brains, and they had detailed pathological assessments for each one, along with those high-resolution MRI scans. That's an incredibly rich data set.
So it's not just the quantity of the brains, but also the quality of the information they had about each one.
Exactly. And that level of detail is crucial for making reliable connections between specific diseases and those unique shrinkage patterns. It allowed them to be much more precise in their analysis.
I'm starting to understand why this research is getting so much attention. But this makes me wonder if we can potentially diagnose these diseases earlier using brain scans. Would that change how we treat them?
That's a great question, and it's something researchers are actively exploring. Early diagnosis opens up the possibility of earlier intervention, which could potentially slow down disease progression and preserve cognitive function for longer.
So it's not just about knowing what disease someone has, it's about what we can do with that knowledge to improve their lives. That's really powerful. But sometimes I'm a bit skeptical. Is it really possible to see those tiny changes in the brain using current technology?
I understand your skepticism, but there's already been some very encouraging progress in this area. Researchers are developing increasingly sophisticated imaging techniques, and they're combining those with powerful computational tools to analyze the data. It's a rapidly evolving field.
So even though we might not be there yet, it sounds like we're on the right track.
I believe we are. This research is giving us the roadmap we need to develop those next-generation diagnostic tools. It's helping us understand the brain in a whole new way.
It's like having a new lens through which to view these diseases, isn't it? But this whole discussion has made me curious about something else. This study focused on shrinkage, but did they see any evidence of the opposite, like those brain structures actually growing or changing shape in other ways?
That's a really insightful question. And the answer is no. They specifically noted that they only observed inward shrinkage, not any outward expansion or deformation.
So it's like these diseases were specifically targeting certain parts of the brain and causing them to shrink over time. But why is that? What's actually happening at the cellular level to cause that shrinkage?
That's a great question, and it's something that requires further investigation. But we do know that different diseases have different mechanisms of action. For example, in Alzheimer's disease, those tangles we talked about can disrupt the transport of nutrients and signals within brain cells, eventually leading to cell death and shrinkage.
So different diseases, different mechanisms, but ultimately the same outcome, shrinkage in specific brain areas. This is giving me a much clearer picture of how these diseases actually affect the brain. It's not just some vague concept anymore.
That's exactly what we're aiming for, to make these complex processes more understandable and relatable. And I think this study does a great job of that. It provides a very concrete and visual representation of what's happening inside the brain.
And that visual representation could be incredibly powerful for helping people understand their own brain health and for motivating them to take steps to protect their brains as they age.
Absolutely. This knowledge can empower individuals to make informed decisions about their lifestyle, their diet, their cognitive activities, all of which can have a significant impact on brain health.
This has been an incredible journey so far, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface. What else did this research uncover? Let's continue our deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were discussing how these different brain diseases cause very specific patterns of shrinkage in those deeper brain structures. It seems like such a huge leap from studying brains after death to actually diagnosing people while they're still alive.
It is a big step, but I think this research gives us a solid foundation to build on. One thing that really impressed me about this study is that they went beyond simply identifying which areas were shrinking. They actually measured the amount of shrinkage in each area.
So it's not just a yes or no, it's actually quantifying how much shrinkage is there. Why is that so important?
Well, imagine you're a doctor trying to figure out if someone has a specific brain disease. Knowing the exact amount of shrinkage in specific areas could help you make a more accurate diagnosis. It's like having a ruler for brain health.
That makes sense. It's like the more detailed the measurements, the more confident you can be in the diagnosis.
Yeah.
But did they look at anything else besides the disease itself? I mean, things like age or lifestyle must play a role too, right?
You're absolutely right. They took all those factors into account. They looked at things like age, gender, education level, even how long it took between death and when the brain was preserved and scanned. They wanted to make sure those factors weren't skewing the results.
So even with all those other variables, the shrinkage patterns were still distinctly linked to specific diseases.
Exactly. It's like each disease has its own signature, a unique fingerprint that sets it apart. And that's what makes this research so exciting. It suggests that we could potentially use brain scans to diagnose these diseases much earlier, maybe even before symptoms start to show. Now that would be revolutionary, to catch these diseases in the early stages when treatments might be more effective. But if this research is so groundbreaking, why haven't we heard about it before? What took so long?
Well, good science takes time. This study involved a massive amount of data collected over many years. They had to analyze hundreds of brains, combine that information with each person's health history, and then develop sophisticated statistical models to make sense of it all.
So it wasn't just about collecting the data, it was about piecing together a complex puzzle.
Exactly. And that takes a lot of time and effort from a dedicated team of researchers. But I think the results speak for themselves. They've given us a much deeper understanding of how these diseases affect the brain, and they've opened up new possibilities for diagnosis and treatment.
Speaking of treatment, did this research give any clues about new ways to approach these diseases?
While this study focused primarily on diagnoses, I think it has huge implications for treatment as well. If we can identify these diseases earlier, we can start interventions sooner, potentially slowing down their progression. So early detection is key. But how would treatment be different knowing this information?
Well, imagine instead of treating symptoms, we could target the specific areas of the brain that are being affected. It's like having a map that tells you exactly where to deliver the medicine.
That's a great analogy. A targeted approach instead of a general one. But I'm curious, what might those targeted treatments look like? Any hints from the research?
It's still early days, but there are a lot of exciting possibilities being explored. Some researchers are looking into ways to stimulate specific brain regions using non-invasive techniques. Others are developing drugs that can target the underlying processes that cause brain cells to die.
So it's like we're moving from a one-size-fits-all approach to personalized medicine for the brain.
Exactly. And that's where I think the real promise of this research lies. It's giving us the tools to understand each individual's disease process in much greater detail, which opens up a whole new world of treatment possibilities.
It sounds like this is just the beginning of a whole new era in brain health. This has been an incredible deep dive, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface. Is there a key takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that even though these brain diseases are incredibly complex, we're starting to understand them in a much deeper way. We're moving from a world of vague symptoms and uncertain diagnoses to a world of precise measurements and targeted treatments.
It's like we're finally shining a light on the darkness. And that's a powerful message of hope for anyone facing these challenges. But before we wrap up, is there a final thought, something to ponder that you want to leave our listeners with?
This study focused on those deeper brain structures, but our brains are incredibly interconnected. What if we expanded this research to look at the whole brain? Imagine the possibilities if we could map out the entire network and see how these diseases affect different regions over time. that could truly revolutionize our understanding of brain health.
That's a fascinating thought to ponder. It seems like with every new discovery, we open up even more questions to explore. Thanks for taking us on this incredible journey through the brain. To all our listeners, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.